everyone. Welcome back to the Kuderna podcast. I'm your host, Brian Kuderna. So on today's episode, we've got a great interview on deck, and I think it's very timely as well. I'm sure many of you have seen in the news that Apple CEO Tim Cook is now stepping down and handing over the reins to a new CEO in John Ternus. So I think it's a great time to look at this company, one of the biggest companies in history, often known as the most innovative company ever. And so we're going to go back to the genesis of it and discuss Steve Jobs. And not just anything about Steve Jobs, but there was a lost decade there that many of you may or may not be familiar with in between when he was ousted from Apple and then made this glorious return to really transform it into the company we all know today with the iPod, the iPhone, the MacBook, and so much more. So joining me today is an award-winning author, Geoffrey Cain. If you're not familiar with Jeff, I'll give you a quick background. He sits down with some of the world's leaders, tech founders, and dissidents. His book, Samsung Rising, was longlisted for the Financial Times and McKinsey Business Book of the Year award. His other book, The Perfect Police State, was named NPR's Book of the Day. He appears frequently in the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, The Economist, and Wired, and has been featured on CNN and Bloomberg TV. He also advises executives and government officials on innovation. His new book is titled Steve Jobs in Exile. And again, this is the period of Steve Jobs' life that a lot of people don't understand, not quite as publicized as his monster successes within the company. So this was a really insightful conversation, and I think a great lesson for leaders out there of when you do get knocked down or you do get cast to the sideline, of how to come back bigger, better, and stronger. So without further ado, here is Geoffrey Cain.
Is going to require work and time and sweat and toil.
If money wasn't an issue, what would I be doing?
Don't worry about it. You'll figure it out.
Change is the only constant.
The Kuderna Podcast.
Jeff, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Brian.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. I know just off camera you were talking about how busy you are with this, the book launch and a newborn. How's the juggling act going?
It's quite a juggling act. I mean, it feels like having twins, and there's a human baby, but a book is sort of like your intellectual baby. It's like, the baby that comes out of the mind, and it's just really something else. So yeah, it's been a crazy time, but a lot of fun. We're having a great time.
That's awesome. Good for you. When did you actually start this project?
3 years ago, almost 4 years ago, it was a project that it was on my radar for a while. I had known about the wilderness years of Steve Jobs. I had known what he had been through during that time. And a lot of that came from my older reporting. When I was younger, I had been covering the Apple versus Samsung trial. That was a major lawsuit when Apple and Samsung sued each other over the shape of their smartphones. And it defined what the smartphone looks like today. A lot of the form factors, the square that you see came out of this lawsuit. And so, this was back in 2011 and 2012. And I was over in South Korea where Samsung is. I was at the courthouse in San Jose covering this trial. And this was also right around the time when Steve Jobs died. He died just within months of this lawsuit. And I remember I was talking to some of the more some of the executives who were either retired or kind of almost retired of that age. They had grown with Steve Jobs. They had known him since he was young, and they knew how he had transformed. And one of the things that, they would usually remark if we grabbed a coffee, they would say, it really is a shame the way that Steve Jobs is depicted out there. We know him as the brilliant jerk, the guy who runs around and scolds people and yells at them and tells them how horrible they are at making the new phone, and you've got to do better. That's how he's always been depicted in films. And one of the things that I found interesting, they universally said this. They said, if you look at the years when he was pushed out of Apple, when he went off into the company called Next Computer, which was his second company, it's a whole different picture. I mean, those are the years where he transformed, and that's where he learned to be the leader who we know. So this is something that I had heard it straight from them. I knew that it was a story that hadn't been told, and I knew that there was an added degree of complexity. There was something more to the man that we weren't seeing because he was being mythologized. There's all this Steve Jobs lore. So I went right in and I said, okay, I have to dig up this story because it's out there. It's sitting there, it's in the archives, it's in people's memories. A generation is getting older, they're starting to die off. The Steve Jobs generation, they're not all going to be around forever. And so this is the
Mhm.
time to document history and get this story down.
That's really cool. And like through all your research and everything, did you ever have a chance to see him in person or actually meet Steve Jobs?
No, never. And I wish I did. I was probably just a tad too young to get to that point. But I
Yeah.
was from the iPhone generation. I was back in college. I had an iPod that was back when it was really cool. Maybe that reveals my age. Getting to meet Steve Jobs would have been a dream of mine. But unfortunately, he was taken from us too early.
Yeah, yeah, no, it really was a shame. And I want to get into his story in the book in a moment, but just for some of our listeners that don't know you or haven't read your books, how like what's your background? How did you get into this space as a journalist and into tech? Like, can you give us just kind of a summary of like your genesis?
Sure. So I was never planning to become a tech journalist. And actually, that's something that landed on me. Sometimes there are
Mhm.
things in life that you do where you set out to accomplish something and you do it. But in the case of technology, I was originally a journalist covering governments, politics. I was, looking at the world of global affairs and what's happening in China, what's happening in Ukraine and in Turkey. I had been a foreign correspondent first. And one of the
Okay.
interesting things, as I was overseas, this topic kept landing on my desk without me seeking it out. My editors would get in touch, and for whatever reason, they looked at me and they said, "Hey, Jeff, so you look like you might be a guy who knows about tech. Maybe you can learn about tech. Can you cover this tech beat for us?" And me, like, yeah, I did use tech. Like, when I was younger, I did play around with coding, and I, made my own website when I was young, back in the early days of the internet. But I was never like a tech. I didn't major in computer science or anything. I majored in international politics. And so
Yeah.
I thought, okay, so this is interesting. I was overseas, and there were these big events happening in Korea and China, and the nature of warfare was changing. The nature of the way that we use drones, the social media was starting to become a tool of spreading misinformation and manipulating
Mhm.
populations. Like, this was a time when I was coming of age as a journalist, when the questions about technology were becoming the questions about everything. And it's almost like I could
Yeah.
see it happening. What happens in Silicon Valley was what was downstream of everything else that was sort of moving in the world, like big major events. So I caught that wave and I decided to ride it. I was in China for a long time. I had studied Chinese in college, and so I was covering, getting really interested in the surveillance dystopia there and how the Chinese government was setting up kind of like a system. Like, if you go read an old novel like 1984, or there's the Philip K. Dick novel, Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, which became Blade Runner. You
Mhm.
walk around China, and it had that gritty feel. I could see it happening, and the level of surveillance was just getting so intense. It was the
Wow.
world's perfect police state, which was the name of my second book, and I wanted to document that. So I dove into that story, and I was surprised to learn that a lot of U.S. big tech giants were involved in helping create that monstrosity, where people are being tracked by AI 24/7 and brought to concentration camps based on what they do in front of the AI system. So truly
What
terrifying.
years were those that you were in China, like living through all that?
So when I was writing that book, it would have been 2016 to 2020. But I wasn't
Yeah.
actually living in China the whole time. I was moving in and out because I couldn't stay in one place in China. The government would have tracked me down and would have, figured out what I was doing and sent me out. And actually, they did. They did get me out of there in the end. They didn't really like what I was doing, so I can no longer go back to China. So
You're
I raised that, like, very different topic from Steve Jobs in Exile. But the reason I raised that is because
now you're in
that
exile.
yeah, well, yeah, I guess it's my own exile. It's like, Jeff Cain in exile
Yeah.
from China. The reason I raised that story, just because, these were the things that I was digging my feet into, and really
Mhm.
seeing just the massive changes happening worldwide. And so, eventually, as I was not able to go to China anymore, I made my way back to the US and decided it's time to pick up, now that I have built a body of work in technology and I'm fascinated with the life of Steve Jobs. It's time to
Yeah.
pick up this story and tell this story.
Out of curiosity, because I mean, his story's obviously been told, lots of great documentaries and movies and books, of course. Out of everybody there and all the different things that you were writing on, like what dragged you right to Steve Jobs and said there's more to be told here?
Well, in all of my work, I've always noticed the tendency to mythologize people. Whenever there's a great
Mhm.
person, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, these leaders, the way that we remember them is often not how they actually were when you pick up the material, when you go deep into their lives and study their biographies. And one of the most interesting things about so many of these people, we remember them as great, but almost all of them went through a wilderness in their life at some point. In the case of Teddy Roosevelt, who became president, one of the biggest presidents in American history, he spent time literally in the wilderness. He was in the Amazon in Brazil with his son, and his son nearly died. And this was one of the big events that sort of forged him into the Roosevelt who we knew. So very common. There's almost like a universal journey that a lot of us have to go through. If you want to reach something great in life, you have to be tested and tamed by the world around you. You have to, go from being someone who's simply hardworking or talented, and you have to go to, someone who's able to harness your abilities and find your true power and know how to channel it to the right things. And that's what I saw in Steve Jobs. It was just, the deeper I went into his life, I just found the wilderness aspect just so revealing, because here's an example of a modern figure still in our memories, whose impact is still outlasting in the world. I mean, how many people have
Mhm.
iPhones? Like, Apple just announced that something like 4 billion people have app there are that's how many Apple devices are out there in the world right now. It's massive, the number. And, how did a company like Apple get here being such a cultural icon? Well, it could only happen because Steve Jobs went through those trials and tribulations, and he faced the fire, instead of cowering back and falling back and saying, I can't do this. He buckled down and he said, I'm going to get through this and I'm going to learn from it. And this is going to make me transform. And that's what Steve Jobs and Exile is about.
Okay. And so for people that obviously your book will really dive into that period, kind of that lost decade. But can you give me like maybe a little summary for other people that haven't followed his life as closely? Like what happened? Because a lot of people think, oh, Steve Jobs, it was Apple, like it was his company, he just built it, period. But like you alluded to, he actually got kicked out by the board of directors from, what everybody seems is like Steve Jobs and Apple are one and the same. So what were the early years like, and how did it actually get to that point where he was shown the exit?
Right. So the story that we often hear is that Steve Jobs was the co-founder of Apple. He founded it in his garage. He built the Macintosh, which was a game-changing computer. And then
Mhm.
there was a power struggle with his CEO John Scully. Steve Jobs was the chairman. He was not the CEO, but he fought with John Scully, who he hired to kind of create like adult supervision at Apple. Because you got to remember, these guys were young. They were in their 20s. They were walking around barefoot and holding up pirate flags literally at Apple. So they needed an adult in the room who could handle, the real business, the deal making, and so forth.
Yeah.
In the end, Steve Jobs, so the way we remember him is that he was brilliant, he was a visionary, and John Scully, out of jealousy, drove him out of the company. And then he wandered in the wilderness aimlessly. And it was 12 years. And then he returned to Apple. He brought back his vision for Apple and he saved Apple from bankruptcy. It was about one quarter its bankruptcy at the time. This was 1997. And then Steve
Mhm.
Jobs, in all his brilliance, went on and created the iPod, the iPhone, the MacBook, the iPad, and built Apple into the massive cultural social force that it is today. One of the most successful companies ever in human history. So here's the thing: that story is all wrong. It's completely wrong. The way the story has been told in pop culture for decades is not actually what happened. It's a version of the story that evolved over time. It's the way that we want to remember him as, the great visionary of our times, but that's not what happened. Here's the real story. Steve Jobs co-founded Apple. He had hits, he was really smart, he was certainly a visionary, and he had a sense of what he had to build. He knew how to take technology and make it beautiful. So,
Mhm.
he would take the clunky computers of the day. Remember, this is the 90s, and a computer was super ugly, and only big corporations could use them. And he said, I'm going to simplify this idea, and I'm going to create the Macintosh, which is a little friendly computer that, even has a little smiley face when it turns on and says hello. And it's going to be joyful, and anybody can use it, and you can draw and paint and type. And that was big, epoch defining moment. But what really happened is that the Macintosh was not a success in sales. People weren't buying it because it was too limited. And as a result of that, Apple went into a crisis, even with Steve Jobs at the helm. Steve Jobs was certainly smart, but also extremely difficult to work with. I mean, if you hate your boss and think your boss is like, like not like worst guy in the world, okay, like try working for Steve Jobs when he's in his 20s. He would go in, he would yell at people, he would call them trash, he would trash their designs, he would overstep his authority. He went into other offices and told people what to do. He spread rumors about the CEO, John Scully, behind his back. Like, it was just so, I mean, Apple was just so dysfunctional, and Steve Jobs actually did contribute to a lot of this dysfunction. So the board and John Scully got fed up after Steve Jobs tried to oust John Scully in kind of a secret coup d'etat. They pushed him out. They sent him across the street to an office. Steve Jobs said, I'm fed up, and he resigned and said, I'm going to go create a new company now. It's not going to be Apple. So, Steve Jobs did not succeed at this new company right away. He actually made the same mistakes that he made at Apple, and he was horrible to work with, and his ideas were too far into the future. The computer that he designed did not sell. I mean, it sold like just a few hundred units a month. The company at one point was almost bankrupt. At one point, Steve Jobs himself was almost personally bankrupt. He was about, maybe had 2 more years worth of cash left, which is not a lot for somebody in his position. And he hit rock bottom, and it was through all these trials, all these tribulations. His co-founders all left him. They were tired. They said, Steve, I can't do this anymore. And, through all this, Steve Jobs saw the light at the end of the tunnel and realized that, this is not working anymore. And he was taught
Yeah.
some lessons, and he said, I'm going to transform.
So his first go around at Apple, like his kind of downfall, that was like his own design. It wasn't so much that other people were, kind of power hungry and just wanted to get him out of there. It sounds like it was a lot of people were not happy working alongside him.
Yep. It was a downfall by his own design. He tried to oust John Scully when John was going to be flying to China for a talk that he was giving. He was going to march into the boardroom and tell them to fire John and make him the CEO. And everybody thought it was totally ridiculous. The people around him, he would ask them advice, and they'd be like, like, dude, you're just irrational. Like, this is not going to happen, and you're not going to be the CEO of Apple. Sorry.
So did
And
he
he
have
even
any like big hits? Like I know you said that's when the Macintosh came out, and it was like a novel idea to make it beautiful and user friendly. But like you said, the sales were actually very low on that. Was there any like redeeming point of like his part one with Apple that was successful or that could kind of be looked upon like in a good light?
so the vision was the success. The sales, the
Yeah.
business was not a success. The Macintosh was a huge leap forward in the democratization of technology. You and I, could sit down and use a computer for like the first time in history.
Mhm.
But no, I mean, other than that, other than his vision, he was making beautiful art. Let's put it that way. And yes, the world needs beautiful art, but art does not always sell.
Yeah. And then when he left the company, is that when Next started? That was kind of no pun intended. That was like the next venture of his, or was there like other little experiments before that actually kicked off?
Well, he also ran off and he bought Pixar from George Lucas. And what happened was that George Lucas was having a nasty divorce and had to offload Pixar because he needed money to pay the settlement. And so he bought Pixar for a super discounted rate. It was $5 million, which is like nothing. I mean,
Wow.
even by the
And this
time,
is when he was almost personally bankrupt, Steve Jobs?
not yet. He was almost personally bankrupt later, about 8 years later. But this was early on. So this was what he did. He founded Next Computer, but he also bought Pixar. And so the idea behind Next Computer was that he was going to make the next high powered machine for universities and laboratories, the cutting edge technology of its day. and
Okay.
Pixar was going to be a machine. So Pixar originally made a computer called the Pixar Image Computer, and the goal there was to make computer graphics, and also to this is one of the lesser known sides of Steve Jobs. They were selling it to intelligence agencies because it was the only computer of the day that could do like serious satellite imagery and data analysis. So they really needed that graphical component.
You're kidding. That's huh.
Yeah.
I've never heard
Well,
that before.
Well, that's one of the stories I uncovered in this book that I was surprised to learn. Steve Jobs was kind of a spook at certain times of his life. He was cooperating with the National Security Agency, the NSA, which maybe people remember that from the Ed Snowden scandals. That's the agency that taps communications around the world and spies on people's phones. He was cooperating with the CIA. He was working with a lot of these groups, and it was controversial because the people who were buying his computers, they were like indies, they were
Mhm.
punks and they were the rebels and they didn't want to be associated with the federal government in any way. So yeah, Steve Jobs, like that was a side of him, and he had to make these compromises because it was he didn't do it because he wanted to. It was a
Yeah.
compromise for survival. He did not want to sell to the
Wow.
Fed. He was a hippie, and he called himself a hippie.
I guess you got to do what you got to do. And so let's talk a little bit about that period. So he leaves Apple, and then what was like that timeline of getting Pixar starting next? And obviously, Pixar is huge. I don't know if that was ultimately the plan for it to become what we know it is today. But what did some of that period look like? What was he going through? How did that maybe kind of create this like second iteration of Steve Jobs?
So Pixar was, we all know Pixar now, and we know Pixar from Toy Story. That's the big,
Of course, yeah.
moment that defined Pixar. But back then, Pixar was nothing. It was struggling. And there was even a story I heard from, somebody working with Steve. They went to a Beverly Hills hotel to give a big presentation about Pixar, and they showed an early graphics, like an early short movie, like a demonstration to a bunch of Hollywood executives and actors, like the A-listers of the day. And they showed
Mhm.
this little movie, and the room just fell silent. Like nobody even clapped. It was just kind of awkward. And Steve was wondering, wait a second. So, isn't this going to like Steve thought it was going to be the future, but, Hollywood did not think it was going to be the future. And they still wanted to
Yeah.
use the old hand drawn animations. And, even Disney would use his technology sometimes, but they didn't want to give him credit, and they only used it sparingly because even they were stuck in the age of hand drawn cartoons. So I just say that because, you got to keep in mind, how different the world was back when Steve was starting this. And it shows
Yeah.
like that's the big theme in this part of his life. He is so far ahead of his time, and it's just incredible. Like the things he was doing in the years, like late 80s, early 90s, it's stuff that hit Apple 15 years later even. I mean, some of the most advanced stuff he was doing, it was like it became the software that they used to make Toy Story. Like that's how advanced he was, and Toy Story was 10 years later.
Yeah.
But, like Steve didn't have a good sense of how to execute. And this is one of the big stories, in business and finance, in tech. An idea is a great thing, but the idea is only one part of the work. Anybody
Mhm.
can pull an idea out of thin air, but the question is, does the physical world actually allow you to do anything with that idea? And that's what Steve even reflected on himself. He actually said that you can't make electrons do certain things. Like you can't make atoms do certain things. And if you go out there trying to make the best device, the best technology that the world has ever seen, you're actually going to be putting yourself in a really bad position because it's so untested that you're the one who's going to absorb all the costs for everybody else out there who's waiting for the moment to release it.
And so, like to that point, what was like? And I don't want to jump ahead, so maybe we'll come back to it. But what I want to earmark is like, what was that tipping point where finally these crazy ideas that were so far down the road kind of collided with reality, and it became a financial success, so it was able to thrive. Was it in this period, or was this not until really the return to Apple?
It took 8 years of suffering for Steve Jobs to get to the point where his ideas in the 80s actually became successes in the late 90s. And we don't remember this. So we tend to think of Steve Jobs as a guy who was always rich and always a billionaire. But
Hmm.
for most of his life in this period, he was not rich at all. I mean, he was rich by normal standards, but he was quickly running out of cash, and he was certainly not a billionaire. So he personally backed some of the debts of his companies. I mean, he was in real trouble. It was not like, he was not running a public company. Let's put it that way.
Yeah,
So here's the thing: Toy Story. We don't associate Toy Story with Steve Jobs, but that's the project that actually made him a billionaire.
that's
So
crazy.
Steve Jobs, owning Pixar. The irony here is that there was a leadership lesson for him the moment he backed away and allowed his teams at Pixar to do the best work they could, and these are the best digital animators of the age.
Hmm.
Toy Story was a success, and not only the movie, but then the IPO a few weeks later after the movie, that was a massive success because Toy Story was just such a hit. And suddenly he was a billionaire. It was just a one-day IPO, and he picked up the phone. He called Larry Ellison,
Wow.
his best friend, and he said, "I'm in the billionaire club. It's awesome."
That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And so, like, in just reading some of your book, I noticed he was personally funding Pixar for about 9 years with like half of his net worth, half the money that he had, while it was just bleeding money. Like, what was he doing at that time? And did he have like a vision? Because it seems like Toy Story was almost like a happy byproduct that like this his other team of his really was able to kind of see the value in, where maybe that he didn't have his eye on that ball per se.
Yeah, yeah. So Steve, he knew that graphics and computer graphics was going to be a revolution. Like he knew that it was going to change everything in the way films are made, and he was right. But the here's where the lesson came in for him. It was the release of control and trusting his team. So at Next
Mhm,
Computer, his other company, that was even more of a disaster for so long because he could not let go of the place. Like it's like he wanted to be the hardware designer, the software designer, he wanted to be the marketer, he wanted to, go in and control everybody's work and, he would push them to the limit, but it's like, Steve ultimately had to sign off on everything. He literally, I mean literally he would type every single job offer letter and sign every single one. So there would be all these,
wow.
really qualified candidates sitting around waiting to take a job with Steve Jobs, and it would just be months and months. And it's like, where's my job offer? And it's like, oh, sorry, Steve Jobs insists on writing your letter and signing it. So, total train wreck. Next Computer was, I mean, of the two, Pixar and Next Computer was the one that was quickly collapsing, and looked like at the time it was going to be the one that was going to drag Steve Jobs under. Um, when they released the first computer called the Cube, this was a highly advanced computer for
Mhm,
science research labs and that sort of thing, and also intelligence agencies. But Steve really wanted to just sell it to those, classrooms. Like he loved the idea of students having it in their dorm room. But the
mhm.
computer costs more than a year's university tuition at the time. And it's just like, I mean, nobody was buying it. So this
Yeah.
is an example of, so they call it the reality distortion field. Steve Jobs can convince anybody of anything, but Next Computer was where that failed and reality actually distorted back against him, and he could no longer convince anybody of everything.
So what happened like through this period? It sounds like he got the lucky break where Toy Story almost like bailed him out financially. Was there any other success like out of Next that carried forward to where we are now in 2026, or did all of that just kind of die and get buried in the past, with maybe some lessons learned? Is there anything tangible from that period with Next? And maybe kind of like a second question to that is like, was he like humble enough to ever say, "Hey, I learned a lesson with Pixar," or "I learned a lesson from my first time with Apple," or was he so kind of, strong-willed that it was like, "No, I'm just gonna keep doing it my way?"
So it's the former, and he actually did learn. So he was strong willed for a long time, and the
Mhm,
former thing that you just said, it was finally when he was breaking, and finally when things were completely falling apart, that he had no choice but to make that transformation. But here's the interesting thing. Next Computer is seen today as one of these companies that's kind of a curious failure, something where they were doing something interesting, but people write it off as a failure. The hardware
mhm,
was a failure, and the hardware division collapsed because people no longer wanted to buy computers. I mean, they would buy computers, but they would buy it from Apple or they would buy it from IBM or Compaq. There were only a few companies that could that had enough brand power and scale to push that. Hardware failed, software became the wild success beyond what anybody could have predicted. Even Steve himself didn't really see this when he was starting to use it. There was a massive innovation happening in the 90s called object-oriented programming. And luckily for Steve Jobs, he was one of the first people to this revolution about 5 years before it caught on. So this was 1986 that he started doing it. The
Mhm.
90s was when, 10 years later, people started adopting it seriously. Object-oriented programming is what is used. So, like, if you pick up an iPhone today, pick up you turn on your Mac computer, all the software is done with objects, and objects means that it's a piece of software. It's an object on the software. So, like something like an icon or a button, and you can drag and drop, and you can shape the software like clay. That was Steve Jobs' big, brilliant innovation. Before that, it was so clunky to make software. It was not scalable at all. You had to, use code only, and you would go through and compile the code and then, create the software, but it would often crash and you would have to go back and start from scratch and do it all over again with instructions as opposed to beautiful items and objects that you could kind of mold together. So what does this mean? This is classic Steve Jobs. It means that you could, as Steve Jobs wanted, make software as a film director would make a film. It's the rough equivalent. And this is the innovation that Apple saw. Apple needed a new operating system in the mid 1990s, and Apple needed Steve Jobs to come back. They were a quarter from bankruptcy, and they decided to buy Next Computer. Incredible story because nobody saw it coming. And this is what allowed Steve to return and lay the foundations for the Apple that we know today.
And so that's why Apple went back, is they wanted to buy what he was doing in the software space.
Yep, yep. And Steve was not eager to return to Apple. Another thing that is often misunderstood about Steve, people think that he marched back in and took control and saved Apple, but he was reluctant and he actually wanted to go off and just run Pixar because he loves Pixar. That was his playground.
Hmm.
He loved the movies. Part of this was because he had kids during these years with his wife, Lorraine Powell Jobs. And, he would sit around at home and watch Toy Story with his son. And I mean, that was some of the life-changing stuff that happened for him. But Next Computer, he was thinking about ditching it altogether at one point. And he was thinking, if Apple has me come back, maybe I'll just be a consultant. And that's what they did originally. So Apple had this idea. They wanted to, have everybody hold up digital candles, and Steve Jobs would return to Apple in a helicopter, and it would land on the roof, and he would enter in this, great gilded ceremony, and he would become the new, Apple guy. That's not what happened. Steve rejected that. He said, I don't want that ceremony. I'm just going to go back and I will be on the sidelines observing, advising, but I do not want to run Apple because it's too much of a disaster.
Huh. So, like, why did he even agree to go back? Like, it's a company that ousted him, and now it's a company that's doing poorly. I mean, it almost sounds like he'd rather just kind of sit back and laugh at them and try and do his own thing.
So I think the words of Larry Ellison actually sum it up best. Larry was really close to Steve during those years.
Mhm.
And he described it this way. He said, Apple is like a lost girlfriend, a lost partner, somebody who you once loved but has gone down the wrong path, and you care for her. Bad things are happening in this person's life, but it's sort of her own doing. And there's not much you can do, but you can help. You can offer some help, maybe write a check here and there, but you can't get back
Hmm.
into a relationship with that person.
Interesting. And so that's how he approached it. He still had some sort of like fondness for the company or some kind of allegiance to try and see them through.
Yep, yep. He had the fondness, he had the memories, and a lot of what he did at Next Computer actually was designed to get back at Apple and get back at John Scully. He was full of resentment during those years, so he did care about Apple.
Mhm.
He did care deep down about his creation, and he saw it as his place. But looking at what Apple had become, so you got to remember, Apple today is really cool, and Apple is at the top of its game. But, if you go back one generation, go back to the 90s when the current generation of iPhone people were just growing up, it was
Mhm.
not cool to have an Apple. And actually, Apple, like back then, you got a Windows PC and Windows was the cool one. Um,
Sure.
But he looked at Apple and he saw what a disaster it was because of the decisions of its leadership over the decade that he was gone. And he said, this is almost hopeless. I don't think I can save this place.
So, like going through all this, I mean, a guy obviously very proud, has a bit of an ego, not unlike a lot of other really big leaders or icons in business. But when he left Apple, I mean, did he like kind of raid Apple and take like his favorite teammates and underlings with him to Next? Or was it a clean break where how did he start building Next from like a personnel standpoint? Like who was he actually working with?
So he was working with some of the best people from Apple. They're some of their best talent.
So he did like steal them away.
Yeah, he lured them. He lured them away. So they came
Yeah.
by their own doing. Although Apple was really upset about that, and they sued Steve personally. They didn't sue his new company. They actually sued Steve Jobs. So they were really upset. So these, to put it in context, these were not senior executives he was taking away. It wasn't a leadership crisis, but he took away some of the most talented
Yeah,
people
the
at the
brains.
mid-senior level of the company, and they had made their mark on Apple. But ultimately, those 5 people did not like where the company was going. They did not really get along with John Scully. He was cutting their departments, cutting their programs, and they decided that their allegiance was ultimately to Steve. And they
Mhm.
love Steve and his creativity, so they followed him at great risk to their own careers. But they followed him and made one of the biggest bets of their lifetime.
I bet. And then when he returns to Apple, is it the same group, the same core that's there? Like when he returned, did he see like he's shaking hands with people he hasn't seen in 10 years? Or is it like a whole new setup?
It was mostly a new generation. Apple had
Yeah.
been through 3 CEOs. So John Sculley had been, fired a few years earlier, and it had been 3 CEOs, and the latest. So the CEO, a guy named Gil Emilio, was
Mhm.
there when he came back, and Gil was having a really hard time retaining executive leadership. I mean, Apple was just sinking. It was such a disaster, and they couldn't retain many executives at all. It was not a good situation, but Steve being Steve, he knows how to look at these situations, and he knows how to he's a guy who can turn it around. It's just that it took him a while to get there and to do it.
Sure. And then at Apple, the big break, I assume, was then the iPod. That was the kind of from his return, that was like the first, as far as I can at least remember, that was the first real break.
That was the first major break. There were some big advances before then. So if you remember the colorful iMacs that was released in '99, that was
Yeah.
his first sort of redesign, the rebrand of Apple. And
Is it
the
like the
idea.
computer that had like the blue back or the pink back, like the shell kind of on it?
Yep, and you could look
Yep.
inside, you could see, the
Yeah.
translucent thing, so you could see the chips inside. I mean, that thing was gorgeous.
Yeah,
Even
it was
today, it's
cool.
kind of cool to look at. It's like people had them in schools. I mean, that's like one of the classic products. It wasn't like the major blockbuster seller like the iPod. The iPod was
Mhm.
really the leap forward, but really Steve's strategy was to cut and to consolidate. Apple, they had 100 research projects going on when he returned. They were producing just dozens of products each year, and it's like internal departments were competing with each other and cannibalizing each other's products. It was really a dysfunctional basket case. And Steve came in and he said, this is something that he really honed in his wilderness years at Next. We had to cut this back and we have to focus. So we're only going to make, 1, 2, maybe 3 core products, and we're gonna change the software. We're gonna use the Next computer operating system. He laid off a lot of people, tragic for them, but he put in new leadership. The new leadership mostly came from Next Computer, and this
Mm.
became the core team that followed him for almost the rest of his life. The people who followed him became his most loyal people, and they were the ones who went in, and they were the ones who all changed Apple together.
Was Tim Cook, was he one of the guys from Next?
Tim Cook was not. So Tim Cook joined Apple after Steve returned, and Tim's role was actually quite different. So Tim, who is now stepping down as CEO, he
Yeah.
was a supply chains guy. And what was happening is that, Apple being close to bankruptcy brought in Tim. Steve really liked him a lot, and his mission was to find a better outsourcing model. Like Steve had originally wanted to make, he wanted products made in America. That was his big thing. But the
Mhm.
economics of it's just the reality. It just wasn't possible. It was too expensive. And so Tim found a way to move supply chains into China. and he's sort of responsible for Apple today, having such a huge presence in China and having such advanced manufacturing in China. And actually, there's a line by a friend of mine, a guy named Pat McGee, who's wrote his own book called Apple in China, and he makes such an interesting argument that Tim Cook. So Apple became Apple largely because of China, and China became China. So much of it because of Apple's involvement there. So,
Wow.
yeah, Tim Cook's got a whole story of his own, and somebody's got to write that biography too.
Huh, that is really interesting. And before Steve Jobs had passed away, I don't remember the transition quite to Tim Cook, but was he the heir apparent? Like, does Jobs actually like get to handpick him, or did that all happen after his passing?
So Steve did pretty much handpick him. I mean, he didn't
Yeah.
walk in and anoint him with a crown or that sort of thing. The board had to get behind him. But yes, Tim Cook was the front runner, and it was clear at the time to most observers that he was going to be the next CEO. And the same thing's
Mhm.
happening now with the new CEO John Turnus. It was very obvious to a lot of people that he was going to be the guy. He's a hardware chief. Apple is placing its bets as a hardware company. That's what they're going to keep doing that in the age of AI. So this has all been
Yep.
very predictable, and that's sort of how Apple is now.
In like, I mean, can you make any comparison between Steve Jobs and then the next man up, with Tim Cook? Because a lot of what you hear about Apple today is that they recognize themselves as the most innovative company maybe in history, and then the most innovative technology over like the past 20 years, AI, they kind of missed the boat. They're not up there with OpenAI and all these other guys that you hear about now. Like, are they being passed by, like, new Steve Jobs, and they lost that ability?
Yes and no. So Apple today is no longer the Apple of Steve Jobs. And we also have to remember, people often look back to Steve Jobs and they say, why can't we have another Steve Jobs now? But the
Mhm.
conditions of today don't really allow for the kinds of innovations that Steve was doing, especially back 20, 30 years ago when he was releasing the iPhone. That ship has sailed, and there's not really room for a new hardware device right now, like a world changing hardware device. But the biggest innovations are in the cloud, AI, energy, data centers. The big questions right now are, how do we keep feeding the AI boom that's happening? If we can't find ways to solve these problems, then we're going to quickly hit the limit of what AI can do. And, that's going to be a disaster because there's so much money going to AI at the moment. I do think if Steve were alive today, he would be all over this. And I think he would just be so fascinated with AI. I mean, he was actually predicting AI 40 years ago. I mean, he was building AI on his next computer and he wanted this to be like one of the models, but the
Mm.
tech just wasn't ready at the time. But it shows you how far he was thinking. Yeah, I think if he were alive today, he would already be on top of AI agents and he would be finding a way to simplify these things. So, like, the new iPhone would be the agentic iPhone, and instead of apps, it would be agents that, do things for you. We haven't gotten there yet because agents are still kind of clunky. And, it's like people try to make a reservation at the restaurant with them and they call the wrong restaurant and give the wrong name and, say the wrong word. Like they're still kind of, not quite there.
Yeah, they're not
But
perfect
yeah, you're
yet.
right. Yeah, Apple has missed the boat on that, sadly. So they're really big on hardware. That's their future.
Do you think there's, like, lessons that either Tim Cook, I know his time's kinda come and gone, but also now the new upcoming CEO, that they could take from this period that Jobs had, that you wrote about, this lost decade, the time out in the wilderness, as you said? Um, I guess not all CEOs get that exposure, and most probably don't want it. They don't want a period of life where it's like, "Yeah, that part of my life totally sucked." Could they almost, like, build that into, like, some sort of CEO training where it's like you're on an island and nothing's going right. And then I just wonder if there's some way, like if that really is what made Steve Jobs who we all know him to be, if there's a way almost to kind of replicate that, to be
Yeah.
able to get all these new great ideas and everything.
That's a cool idea, a wilderness training, and except it's not like army training where you literally go into the wilderness. You have to you're thrown into a boot camp and you have to innovate or perish, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's an interesting idea, and that's something that it could work. I guess one of the problems at Apple is that the culture has become a lot more risk averse, and really now they're much more about the incremental innovation as opposed to the one big smash product like the iPhone. They're
Yeah.
really more now about preserving the infrastructure that they've created, and they're very successful at this. Like, we can't call Apple a failure; it's a $4 trillion company, but
Yeah.
the goal now is steady preservation of that success rather than the great leap forward. So, I yeah, like companies need things like red teaming. They call it red teaming is when somebody opposes you and acts as your rival and like or competitor and messes with your plans.
Mhm.
That's kind of like a wilderness training, but you don't really see a lot of that right now in corporate America. The tendency is to be risk averse.
I know, and like you hear that, and it's almost a shame to hear because you know that that's where so much of the cool things that we appreciate today came out of that.
Yeah.
Like Zuckerberg, famous, when it was Facebook before Meta, that they always had those kind of like Friday breakouts where you got in
Mhm.
teams and it was like, I want to hear the absolute craziest idea of the week. And they would almost compete on like who could be more ridiculous. And then something would actually come out of that. I just don't know why these huge tech companies that pride themselves on innovation would ever get away from that and kind of like put themselves in a box.
And that is it's I mean, you hit it on the head, and it is a shame. There's certainly a lot going on right now with AI and potentially space exploration. There are frontier areas, but the general corporate world is not doing that. The general corporate world is actually, when you look at the numbers, not going through an easy time right now. You look at the major companies of our time, and there's SpaceX and Tesla, and big social media companies that can harness data are doing well, private data on you and me. But
Yeah.
the average company of like past eras, so a place like General Electric, these are major names that we tend to forget. Ford Motor, like all
Mhm.
American names, but they don't play much anymore into our public imagination. And part of the reason is that they just don't innovate. It's like they're there. They invented great things in their day, but they don't have much of an incentive to really push the leading edge. And like they don't have much of a reason to become the next SpaceX, for example.
Yeah. Do you think that's like the closest parallel to Steve Jobs is like a Elon Musk that would do something crazy and then say, I'll do something even crazier now, like watch me. And like it seems like he just kind of keeps re-upping it. Like he's not afraid to lose it all, it seems.
So I think they have some similarities in the sense that they're so interested in building the future. But I
Mhm.
think that the differences outweigh the similarities much more. And they are very different people.
Yeah.
The one biggest difference is that Steve Jobs was intensely focused. He
Mhm.
wanted to consolidate everything. I want to take all this tech and I want to make it into one phone and only one phone. And you get one color that's white at the start.
Yep.
It's like he was all about like, here's what it is. The customer doesn't know what they want until you show it to them and you can take it or leave it. But it's so awesome that you're going to love it. That's the Steve Jobs philosophy.
Sure.
Elon Musk, so brilliant in his own way, but scattershot. He's all over the place. I mean,
Yep.
there are interviews with them where he talks about how he works and, he'll spend 1 hour solving a problem, reading about, Starship engines, and there's a problem with one part and he'll, you know, read a zillion pages on it really quickly and listen to his advisors and then make a decision and move on to the next thing for the next hour. He just has this expanse, and it's almost superhuman in a way. I don't know, if Steve Jobs were around, I don't know like what these two guys would think about each other, to be honest, and I don't want to speculate too much. But I do think if Steve were still alive, he would still be hyper focused. I also think he might be doing something in maybe the environment. I could see him maybe trying to develop maybe some kind of device or some kind of energy related device that cuts carbon emissions. Like that's the kind of thing he was also really into. So yeah, but that's not really so much of an Elon thing, I think.
That's interesting. And I guess maybe to kind of close out some of this, I could talk about Steve Jobs all day. He is a fascinating being. I had read that when he had kind of groomed Tim Cook to take over, that, Tim Cook was asking for advice, and Steve Jobs said, never ask yourself what I would do, just do the right thing. And
Hmm.
I know when Tim Cook just said he's going to step down, you heard that quote quite a bit. What do you think Steve Jobs meant by that? Because I feel like a lot of CEOs that they would want to kind of have that "what would I do" mentality passed on, where he was kind of like, "No, like you're your own guy. Like don't ever look at me. Just
Mhm.
do the right thing." I feel like that right there was almost like cutting the tie from like the old apple and saying we're letting this go and you guys make it whatever you want it to be.
Yep. Well, that's actually a lesson he learned in the wilderness. Learning how to hone your creative intuition and not get distracted by things that don't matter. He The way that he hired people, he wanted people who had a force of personality. He wanted people who could stand up to him. This is
Mm,
something that he evolved over time. He wanted people who would push back. So, if Steve told you your idea isn't good enough, he wanted you to push back on him and say, "Here's why it's good. Here's what it's going to do." So I've got it down, and I think that's what he was saying when he said that quote. He was saying, "You have yourself, like you have your gut, you have your intuition, you have ideas and ways of doing things that you have honed over so many years of your life. You have the experience and you have the maturity, but it's a matter of trusting what you've learned and trusting what's inside you and learning how to stand up for it and defend it."
that's a great insight. I'm glad you broke it down like that too. And to that point, to get other people around him that just weren't yes men, that actually pushed back. I mean, you don't really hear the other names. Like, was there ever a time, whether it be the iPod, the iPhone, the App Store, all the Pixar, all these different things, that it was like somebody else's idea? Like, did Steve Jobs ever say that? Like, "Oh, Joe over here, when he gave me this idea, we just took it and ran with it." Or was it, it just seems like it really all came from him alone.
That was so Steve Jobs did not, I don't think that he actively tried to go around taking credit for everything, but the sheer charisma he had, the sheer, the way that he could bend reality to his will, it's just power. He's a guy, power snaps to him and
Mhm.
image snaps to him. And so that's actually what the world did for him. We mythologized him as he grew older. We mythologize that image of the man in the turtleneck, standing up and holding up this little rectangle that he's convincing you it's gonna change the world. If anybody else had done that, we wouldn't believe them. But since Steve Jobs did it, we believed him.
Yeah.
So I think that's why he tends to get credit for things. But in the entire research and reporting process of this book, it became so clear the sheer amount of people who were involved in helping make Steve Steve. I mean, the software, the hardware, the design, the I mean, down to like the documentation for the computers. Like, I mean, there was so much that went into making this Steve brand, and so many people who had these really demanding perfectionist approaches to things, and all of that taken together, their belief in Steve's vision is what created Steve as we know him now.
Do you think he liked that? Like becoming the brand? You hear some of these like real like geniuses, they just want to do the thing and then get out of the limelight. They don't even want to step on a stage. Do you think he enjoyed
Yeah.
it? Like being looked at like, wow, that's Steve Jobs?
That's a good question, and if I were to guess, I would say that he did enjoy it because he was
Yeah.
always a showman. I mean, that was the original Steve Jobs talent even before his wilderness fires. He could stand on a stage and he could dazzle people and he could show them cool tricks with this computer and that computer. And I mean, that was Steve, and that's how we knew him. He was the center of attention.
Hmm.
Yes, I do think that he enjoyed being the center of attention, but I know from my own work that behind the scenes, he was not always like that. And especially as he matured, he would do things, acts of humanity. He was not being selfish. He would, if an employee had a medical emergency with their kids and this actually happened, he would call the top hospital in the country and arrange the helicopter medevac for them and, get that all together. Like, that's what he did in his private life. And that side of Steve has not really been seen. But that's not the Steve that we think of as Steve. We think of the guy who takes all the credit.
Very true. So this was a really interesting conversation. Is there anything, Jeff, that we missed or that, you picked up along the way and you're like, man, I really wanted to share this? And anything we didn't cover today?
Well, I think that the one, you know, point, why this book is, I guess, what is the power of this story? This is not just a story about technology. Like one of the profound things I've found researching this story is just how life-changing the wilderness years were for Steve, and just how universal this is. It's a trope. It appears in mythology, in legends, ancient stories and lore going back to the Greeks and the Babylonians. It appears in movies, in Star Wars. There's always a middle section where the hero is down and out and has to face the demon and has to grow and then return to the village mature and knowledgeable. And I think the profound part of this story is that, look, if Steve is going through this, if Steve is down and out and he's having a hard time, whatever hard times people are having out there in the world, if you're in the wilderness, like if Steve went through it, then, put that into perspective and you'll be able to get through it.
Yeah, it's really cool. And then you come back bigger, better, and stronger. So,
Yeah.
well, thank you very much for this interview, Jeff. This is extremely interesting. And I'll certainly leave a link in the show notes. Again, everyone, the new book is called Steve Jobs in Exile. It'll be a great read. So thanks again for your time, Jeff.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Yep. All right, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Kuderna podcast. Wherever you're watching or listening, please consider leaving a review, giving us a thumbs up, or telling a friend, and we will see you next time.
This podcast is intended for the general public and for informational purposes only. The show does not provide any recommendations or investment advice regarding any specific account type, service, strategy, or product, or to otherwise act in any fiduciary or other capacity. Please contact a financial professional for guidance and information that is specific to your situation. Brian Kuderna does not provide tax or legal advice. Please contact your accountant or legal advisor to discuss your situation. Guest speakers and their firms are not affiliated with or endorsed by Park Avenue Securities, Guardian, or Kuderna Financial Team, and opinions stated are their own. All investments contain risk and may lose value. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. References to specific securities, asset classes, and financial markets are for illustrative purposes only and do not constitute a solicitation, offer, or recommendation to purchase or sell a security. Brian Kuderna is a registered representative and financial advisor of Park Avenue Securities, LLC, PAS. OSJ 300 Broadacres Drive, Suite 175, Bloomfield, New Jersey, 07003. Phone number 973-244-4420. Securities products and advisory services offered through PAS, member FINRA SIPC. Financial representative of the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, Guardian, New York, New York. PAS is a wholly owned subsidiary of Guardian. Kuderna Financial Team is not an affiliate or subsidiary of PAS or Guardian. California Insurance License Number 0K04194.